Good morning, class. This week for our Introduction to Psychology class, we're going to be looking at states of consciousness. Um, with this in mind, we are coming up to the midterm next week. So the best way for everyone to start preparing for that is to make sure that you go back and look over your quizzes, go back and look over the assignments we've done. I will be doing all the grading and catching up on the grading for that, for anything that's not graded this week. So you want to make sure you're staying on top of that. But for my midterms, for those that have not had me before, I keep it very formulaic. There will be about 10 short answer questions, which will be in many ways reflective of the questions we've had on the quiz. Maybe sometimes either graded a little bit more stringently, more specifically, or they will be expanded upon a little bit, so that I'm asking you for a little bit more information than I do on the quizzes, but they will be reminiscent of the quiz himself, of what you've seen already. Otherwise, we will have 2 short essays, where I'm then giving you kind of a more full topic to sit and discuss, and those will be a little bit more reminiscent of our assignments. So the things I'm going to ask for the midterm, you've been doing all semester long, so you should be pretty comfortable with what's coming your way. When it does come to my midterms, they're not timed. They are open note, open text. You can use anything you want except for each other. So as long as you're not getting answers from other people, you'll be more than fine. And then, so like, the things to keep in mind with them is that they're not timed, so you can start them, you can stop them. You can make sure that you have plenty of time to get them done. They should only take about an hour. But since I give you all this extra time and I'm full on the resources, you can use whatever resources you need. The one thing I do say with our quizzes is that if you it's like the quizzes. If on the midterm you call me up or text me at, or send me an email at 11 o'clock midnight on Sunday night, oh, I didn't get this turned in, my response will simply be that, all right, you don't get it in. Because you will have literally had all week to take care of that. And if you're not going to take care of that business in a timely fashion outside of emergencies, we're not going to give you any sort of leniency to get those done, because and part of that is because I have grades that are due the next day or next week, so I won't have time to turn around and catch up with you on why you didn't do your work. So I will open up the quizzes Monday morning next week, open up the midterm Monday morning next week, and then you will have till the following Sunday at midnight to get it turned in. And I will be a stickler when it comes to turning it in a timely fashion. And every semester I know I have people that are like, well, something happened and I was taking it, my computer died, my internet went out, the quiz or the midterm messed up. And I'll simply say you lose points. You might be able to turn it in late depending on what it is, but you're going to lose points for that no matter what. And that's simply because if you're waiting till midnight on Sunday night to get it done, you're setting yourself up for failure. And so we have to hit a point where students come to the conclusion that they don't want to set themselves up for failure anymore. So make sure you do the midterm well throughout the week. Like I said, you should be able to start and stop it. That way, if anything does happen, you can contact me on Thursday and be like, hey, here's an issue with the midterm, can we help? And I'll be like, of course I can help. But Sunday night at midnight, when you send me your email saying, oh no, look at all these problems, I won't be able to help you. So, okay. Otherwise, we do have another quiz, assignment, discussion board this week. Next week we won't have any of those. We will just have the midterm. So otherwise, let's make sure we're continuing on with our work. You guys have been doing a great job with that so far. And let's talk a little bit about consciousness. It's a very, very fascinating concept. Consciousness is the concept of who we are, self-awareness, it stems back to a lot of our most interesting philosophy is driven by this question of consciousness. Descartes' famous phrase was cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And it is our ability to think and our ability to rationalize and our ability to locate that rational thought within ourselves that makes us so uniquely human. Or maybe it's what gives us consciousness itself. But locating consciousness and putting down a sort of like hard definition of what makes human consciousness unique is a very tough thing to do. It was Nietzsche's rebuttal to Descartes. He said, cogito ergo sum is a statement of assumption. The statement of I is an assumption. The statement of existence, I am, is yet again another assumption. He said that all that you can know for certain is that something thinks, therefore something is. The attribution of that thing to yourself is not quite as certain. And that's something that we kind of looked at a couple weeks ago with the whole right brain, left brain, hemispheric tension. We say I think, but when we say I, do we mean the two lobes of the brain? The two lobes of the brain working in concert, the two lobes of the brain working in contention, the right lobe of the brain, the left lobe of the brain? What happens when the brain itself gets split so that there are two distinct working entities? Is it still an I? And so, Nietzsche, without even knowing all that sort of neuroscience, was kind of on the point. He said there is a thing that thinks, therefore there is a thing that is. But we start to make these assumptions when we say I. But philosophical debates aside, let's take it for granted that the I that we think of is the I of ourself. So what constitutes our human consciousness? Part of it is awareness, a self-awareness. The idea that I can say to myself, I'm sitting in a room with a light on, covered by bookshelves and DVDs and books and writings, and looking around, I can locate myself. I know where I am and who I am. I am, Instructor Nathan Steele, 32 years old, and I have this history that is as aware of where I have been, what I have done, and there's a sort of continuity between the past and the present. So that's a really big deal, a first step in kind of assessing consciousness. You've seen it on TV shows where the doctor says, to the person coming out of coma, what is your name? Do you know what year it is? Who is the President of the United States? These sort of kind of general locating questions that kind of define, are you conscious of what's going on? And that comes from a sort of awareness. The next thing, that kind of helps center our consciousness is understanding. Not only just a cognition of the rudiments and details and bolts and nuts of what's going on, what year it is, what day of the week it is, what is your first, middle, and last name, but kind of, again, that sort of continuity of understanding what that all means for you. What does it mean when you say that, my brother is David, my sister is Melanie, my mother is Jan? Who are these people? Do you understand not just the details of them, but how those details interrelate to yourself? And that's a much, much more tough thing than just simple awareness. You might have an awareness that it's daylight, but it's through understanding that we understand that we know that daylight is part of this diurnal nocturnal cycle, and as human beings, being diurnal creatures, daylight means waking hours, means productivity hours, means sunlight hours for vitamin D, production of neurochemicals through all sorts of things, and so what we have is not just an awareness of its daytime, but what that means at a biological level, perhaps, but also at a social level. What consciousness also means is intuition. And by intuition, I mean the sort of impulses that arise from either our subconscious, unconscious, whatever terminology we might end up using at the end of the day. These sort of impulses that direct and drive our actions. Our impulse to go meet someone, our impulse to fall in love, our impulse to respond negatively towards negative stimuli. These sorts of things are part of our consciousness in that they drive through basic sensory information. They drive our actions. And then these sorts of like more complex intuitions, which are still just response stimuli, like responses to predators. There's a sort of evolutionary intuition that has been observed that certain people will respond very negatively, almost instinctively, to sociopaths. Someone might say, oh, well, that's just, their intuition. You don't need to worry about that. But at the same time, there's enough evidence to kind of support that such intuitions are probably a type of defense mechanism. That, as there are human predators that are willing to predate upon other humans, there is a sort of evolutionary response to warn the individual about that, so that you're not just helpless. So those sorts of intuitions can be complex biological interactions for self-preservation. Another really, really important facet of human consciousness is the social interaction. This kind of goes back towards our earliest, again, kind of philosophies about what does it mean to be a human. But we were originally, one of the philosophies is that we were born in tandem, that we had this sort of duality to us, and so that every soul was formed of two parts interacting with one another. Which is, kind of wild and kind of weird, but it's, from a kind of Jungian myth perspective, the idea that we are born as social creatures and that we come to existence as social creatures. Therefore, when we're thinking about what makes us people, it's that social interaction that starts to let us kind of evaluate and separate what are my thoughts from other people's thoughts, what is my will from other people's will. And by evaluating that sort of difference, we can see ourselves. It's kind of like contours. Without lines that separate images, you could look at a painting and everything would just be one big blur. But by having that sort of interaction between line and shape, color and not color, you actually start to see true contours of what is taking place. And that's kind of how social interaction, or this sort of heuristic process, works. Our consciousness is driven by not only thinking about who we are, but thinking about who we are not. I am not that person. I am not this individual. And that's something as simple as the person who's standing right next to me, or as complicated as I am not this character person who I'm not going to be a liar, a cheater, adulterer, that sort of thing. Where we start to define ourselves through this process of what you are and what you are not. And so consciousness has many, many levels going on of what makes a person conscious of themselves, and how is that consciousness born out. And then we're going to be looking for the rest of our lesson kind of at what are some of the common ways in which that consciousness can be altered, changed, dare I even say erased a little bit, especially when we start talking about the interactions of the consciousness and drugs. But yeah, it's a very difficult thing to just kind of pin down when we say what is human consciousness. And so far I've given you several different aspects of it without giving a holistic definition for what is consciousness. And that's because this is something that is definitely up for contention. it would be overly presumptuous to say that science is settled on an idea of what is human consciousness and how has it come about. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, one of the first kind of like altered states of consciousness that our textbook talks about is hypnotism. And hypnotism is something that has a kind of fascinating roots to it. These roots that kind of come from this sort of stagecraft. There was this guy that I think his name was maybe Joseph Mesmer, but he has these performances back in the 18th centuries where he's hypnotizing people and he's communicating with animals and all these strange and interesting things. But from that, we have this entire centuries of psychics and hypnotists and swamis, gypsy people that can tell the future, and kind of going back into how do we read people and how do we not necessarily control, but pretend to control, or in some cases actually control. How do we implant these sort of suggestive behaviors? And it's something that's been much celebrated as a part of our culture. Even at times, it sometimes can be an ostracized part of our culture. But, we had people balking like a chicken on live TV back in the 60s and 70s and 80s where, the power of hypnosis is being demonstrated. But there is an element, a constant element of sort of like theater to it, which seems too weird to be true. So a little bit of what we want to talk about is some of the science of hypnotism, and what a lot of psychologists would end up saying is that hypnosis represents a sort of altered state of consciousness, not necessarily like an unconscious state. Because there is no truly unconscious state. One of the hallmarks of hypnotism is where you dangle the watch back and forth and you say, go to sleep, go to sleep. I'm going to count backwards from 10, and at 10, your mind will be shut down. And while that's definitely part of the whole suggestive process, the idea of the brain turning off like a computer turns off is one of falsehood. The brain never shuts down in that sort of kind of mechanical, electronic way, the way we might turn off a light bulb, the way we might turn off a computer. Even in periods of sleep, as we'll talk about later, and hopefully you guys will read in the chapter, there's a lot of complicated things going on during sleep. So instead of saying this is like an unconscious state or a hypnotic state where the brain is shut down, it's an altered state, a state where someone is willing to let themselves enter into this sort of suggestible mode where they're very willing to take suggestions. And so we might end up saying that like hypnosis is actually more of a process of self-hypnosis, of you convincing yourself what is taking place is real and then acting accordingly. And this is something that we have seen a couple times already. Something that maybe we can kind of bridge the gap between the mystical, the illusory sort of hypnosis of stagecraft, of theater, with what we're really talking about in sort of a self-suggestive state. Because we've looked at like the placebo effect. We've looked at like perception blindness. We've looked at a couple different things this semester where the mind is making real and ignoring what it wants to ignore and noticing what it wants to notice in such a way that kind of, again, is pointing to this ability for the mind to make things real as it will. And it's a very interesting process. And hypnosis as a form of therapy has a very checkered past, but it also has shown a lot of promise in either helping people to ignore pain, helping people to overcome addictions like smoking, creating physical abilities, sensory information, amnesia. And again, this is where we kind of look at its checkered past. Maybe some of you guys remember there was, psychologists that would put children in a state of amnesia, and then in these amnesic states they would recall repressed memories of child abuse, and like parents were going to jail because of that, and almost a sort of like Salem witch trial thing. And this is again kind of like 70s and 80s when we're trying to put a grasp on hypnotism. And a lot of these cases were just patently false. Again, kind of marring the name of hypnotism as any sort of valid psychological practice. Because, we had a few people that were trying to make big names and not able for themselves as hypnotists, and it did not separate fact from fiction in a very efficient way. And again, we kind of had this sort of like Salem mass hysteria where victimization of a crowd, or the supposed victimization of a crowd, triggered future victimizations of other crowds, and it just got all complicated. But we have, again, there is the possibility of sort of like retrieving repressed memories through that sort of entering that suggestive hypnotic state. And when it comes down to looking at the math on it, it's been found that almost 40% of the people are viable subjects for hypnotism. And this shouldn't surprise us. When we look at how many people were willing to fall victim to change blindness. Where, in that one clip I asked you guys to look at, the guy literally swapped from a white guy to a black guy. About as different as you can get in terms of physical appearance, and people are like, oh, it's the same person. We might shake our head, but in that moment, there is a lot of people who are willing to fall victim to change blindness. And hypnosis is kind of a more intentional, sort of pushing people into a suggestive state, and then getting them to believe or act in certain ways that the hypnotizer might want. So we're seeing this sort of like, I don't want to say gullibility, because gullibility is not the right word, but just susceptibility to all sorts of cognitive blindness. And misthinking, and it's a very, very real part of who we are as humans and what we do. So when we're thinking about other altered states, kind of transitioning away from hypnotism, which is just kind of almost an aside, but definitely an interesting aside, one that I want us to think about, because it's again taking us back to this bigger question of what makes me the conscious person, the self-aware individual, the self-determined individual that I think I am. But it's to look at the importance of sleep. But sleep is one of those most important things for not only during the period of sleep. Our body sends signals to calm the body. Our mind sends signals to calm the body down, to stop muscular movement, to change digestive patterns, to alter blood flow. But it also does a lot not only for repairing the body, but repairing the mind. And so sleep, if you deprive yourself of it, I don't know how many of us have ever suffered from insomnia. Numbers would suggest that most of us in our class have probably suffered from some form of insomnia, at least a little bit. But we've probably suffered, a couple of us at least, including myself, have probably suffered some forms of extreme insomnia, at least at one point or two in our life, where we've gone days for not sleeping. And the effects of such extreme forms of insomnia are actually quite pronounced. I remember I had a period down when I was in college, and then I actually traveled to Japan. And I was already not sleeping, but when I went overseas, I just kind of like snapped and stopped sleeping altogether. And I would go like 2 days or 3 days without sleeping. And the sort of like stress it put on the body, but also the stress it put on your mind in terms of memory retention, acuity, mental acumen, was very, very difficult. You actually start to lose some of those higher functions. I do believe, I think the record for not sleeping is something like 11 days. But ultimately, like sleep is such a necessary component that if you don't sleep, you will die. And so, like, not sleeping, I think when we say the record was 11 days, the record was 11 days of someone that actually lived. Because people that go that long without sleep oftentimes die from whatever is preventing them from sleeping, whether it's a neurological condition or sort of like bacterial infection or something else that's preventing them from actually sleeping. But despite all these negative things, one good night's sleep can erase a lot of built-in deprivation. So, like, if you sleep poorly for an entire week straight, where you're sleeping 2 to 3 nights an hour, or 2 to 3 hours a night, one full night's rest has shown that it kind of takes care of you in a neurological sense. Which kind of goes against some of the popular wisdom that we see today. If you haven't ever heard of like the sleep debt, which is this sort of quasi-scientific approach to sleep that says, we have to get 8 hours of sleep a night, and every night you don't get 8 hours of sleep, you incur a debt. And so, 2 hours here, 2 hours there, 2 hours there, and now you owe your body several thousand hours of sleep, and it's going to kill you, sort of thing. But that sort of logic is actually out there in the world and discussed, but does not seem to have a huge bearing in actual scientific process, in actual scientific discussion. So, when we are sleeping, there are several different stages of sleep, and you can look more in detail in our book, but essentially what we have are the 4 different stages, where the first stage is, you're just kind of in this light sleep, where your mind is shutting down and, you don't really have dreams or anything else. But stage 2 is when your body starts to really shut down. Because when we're sleeping, our heartbeat slows, our breathing pattern slows, digestion slows, everything kind of just powers down so that the mind can start to do all the things that it needs to do without sort of extra external stimuli. We'll talk a little bit more about night terrors later and what happens then, but basically your body goes to sleep. Stage 3 of sleeping is when delta waves start to show up in your brain patterns, because what they do in looking at people sleeping, they hook up all these sorts of electrodes to your brain or to your skull, not your brain itself, and they'll do these sleep studies where they can see when is what taking place. And they have, I guess, what they're called delta waves. And that's the appearance of these sort of deep electric waves passing through the brain that kind of take us to stage 4, which is where we start to have REM sleep, or deep sleep. And REM is just rapid eye movement. It's something that people have observed, and maybe we've observed it ourselves, where the eye is just twitching rapidly. And in the process of doing it, this is when people will end up saying that dreams are starting to take place. And this is kind of, and though dreams have been highly up for debate, this is where the whole organization of memories are starting to take place, and dreams are coming out. So, getting to that sort of stage 4 sleep is one of the most important things possible for the human mind. Now, when we're thinking about all the different things that might ail us while we sleep, we've already talked a little bit about insomnia. There is a difference between sleep and unconsciousness. So, one of the reasons when we're talking about insomnia, if you ever have experienced it yourself, or, someone might be telling you about it, for people that are suffering from severe insomnia, the option of just taking a bunch of pills or drinking yourself to sleep doesn't actually hold much appeal, because there is a huge difference between sleep where the brain enters into that sort of stage 4 deep sleep and mere unconsciousness. If you are to like chemically alter yourself into a state of unconsciousness, you still may not get the sort of rest and deep stage 4 sleep that you need to feel refreshed and rejuvenated. And so when we're thinking about insomnia, the advice that you should probably not give someone is, well, just go take a bunch of, Sambia? Or whatever pills people are taking to fall asleep, because that doesn't necessarily fix any of the problems. Putting someone unconscious is drastically different from putting someone or from actually going to sleep. But then there are other forms of sleep deficiencies outside of just not getting enough sleep. There's somnambulism, and that's where the word ambulatory, ambulance, kind of comes from, which means movement or walking. But it's the idea of sleepwalkers. And these are people that could, on occasion, even be like appearing fully functional, but be completely unconscious and unaware of the things that they're doing. And it's a pretty well documented phenomenon. And not only is it sort of just like somnambulism, like sleepwalking, but as the book kind of mentions, there's a lot of other variant forms of this, like sleep eating or sleep sex, where people will literally go to their partner and have sex in their sleep and not even be aware of anything that they did during that process. The body is not being shut down in the whole stages of deepening sleep where the body gets shut down. It's not taking place in these sort of somnambulist cases. So what we end up seeing is all these variant functions that are taking hold and taking place while the mind is able to retreat further into itself. So we have this sort of very strange and unique kind of cool may not be the right word for the people suffering from it, thing taking place that kind of highlights the disparity between the physical, the material, and consciousness. Because the mind can be completely checked out and the body be performing. Now, kind of a different variation of that, or not necessarily, nightmares are one, but night terrors are kind of another form of that, just in the opposite direction. Whereas somnambulists, the body comes to wake as the mind goes to sleep and starts doing all of its sleep functions. Night terrors are when the mind wakes up, but the body does not get those signals. And so people that have night terrors oftentimes end up feeling this entire sort of paralyzed helplessness because they wake up and the mind is starting to try to make real what's going on, but in the meantime their body is completely not responding. So there's been a whole lot of theorization and, I dare say demonology, actually, is what comes to mind. People will describe, it's a demon sitting on my chest. And so these sorts of psychological responses that are night terrors have oftentimes actually been in the past described as sort of like demon possession. Where people can see what's going on, but their mind is not, their body is not their own. And that comes from the fact that they can't control what they're feeling. So they might have a sort of numbness, they might, feel like their body's in pain, or be sending any sort of other sensory informations that are just not real. And that's the mind trying to get control back over the body. And so it's something that people have this sort of, I'm sitting on the shoulders of myself description. And it's a very strange phenomenon. I don't know if any of you guys have ever experienced it. But historically, some of the old psychologists like William James in the 20th century kind of ascribed this to ascribed sort of like demon interactions with this sort of night terrors, because it's correlating the brain waking up without the body waking up in conjunction, which is, as I said, kind of the opposite effect of what's going on with somnambulism. Couple more maybe less sensational things that happen during sleep. Sleep apnea, which most of us will probably just think of as like snoring. But that's another case that's kind of pretty common, where there's a sort of like loss of control over the diaphragm, or upper respiratory airways, where you have this sort of trouble breathing, and for a moment you might stop breathing. And depending on the severity of it, this is actually, I think, what's called SIDS, what can occasionally cause a child to just die in its sleep, which is, always very tragic. But the kid just stops breathing, and it's not anything the parent has done. It's just that the brain is not regulating breathing in a way that is conducive for sleep. So it can be a very dangerous thing in infants. But then for adults, there's a lot of different apparatus that people end up wearing to try to fix this. Not only is snoring something that we conceive of as pretty annoying, but there is a certain danger to sleep apnea. That you might, get worse and worse and worse and stop breathing in your sleep and then not wake up. Or that you continually stop breathing in the middle of the night and then wake up repeatedly as a byproduct of it and not be able to achieve that sort of full night's sleep that you're desiring. So there is a certain amount of therapeutic possibilities for fixing sleep apnea. The last thing to talk about when we're talking about sleep deficiencies is narcolepsy. And narcolepsy is where, responding to different triggers, a person ends up just falling asleep outside of their own control, or outside of like the normal rhythm of, okay, I've gotten tired, let me go lay down, I'm winding down, I'm getting more tired. No, narcolepsy is when, maybe a car backfires and that triggers a fear response and you just fall asleep. It's again kind of one of those sleep disorders that's strange and peculiar, and in the wrong situations can be very dangerous if we're talking about while driving. But a little bit odd. So I don't want to spend too much time, because we will obviously be coming back towards the unconscious later in the semester. But there are several different and important theories of dreaming, and I just wanted to spend a moment kind of covering them, since while we're sitting here talking about sleep, we might as well cover this issue of dreaming as well. But our book outlines 3 different theories of dreaming: the psychodynamic theory, the activation synthesis theory, and then the neurocognitive dream theory. And just to kind of like break them down, the psychodynamic theory is what we think of when we think of a normal sort of Freudian dream analysis, Freudian Jungian dream analysis, where our dreams are these sorts of symbolic reworkings of all the things that are troubling us, and we can start to unpack the sort of unconscious mind through analysis of these dreams. And there's obviously been spent so much ink on this sort of work, and far be it from me or anyone else that's not like vastly overqualified to do comment on this, because obviously it is a much researched, much discussed, much hammered out process. We have entire tomes that are written on it, but there are some other theories that are just much more mundane. The activation synthesis theory is this idea that like some parts of the brain are waking up while other parts of the brain are being put to sleep, and this causes a sort of dynamic tension between just different parts of the brain functioning. And in order to do so, especially in this sleep state, while the body itself is kind of being rendered inured, rendered inactive, the mind makes up stories to itself in order to explain what's taking place. And so the sort of activation synthesis theory is just the brain telling stories to the brain, but very rarely having anything or not having anything to do with what's taking place. And then the sort of neurocognitive approach is not so fantastical, but it's simply saying as your brain is collating all the memories of the day, it's looking at them. So as the brain is kind of watching this film strip of what's taken place, that film strip filters into your consciousness. And, you know, a lot of us will probably end up wanting to say that our dreams feel like they mean something. Of course, they need to mean something. And this is definitely a very important theory or important thought to continue holding. But there's definitely a lot of neuroscientists and psychologists out there who are kind of along the lines of the dreams don't mean near as much or anything. Especially in our more modern times, we seem to have drifted away from that classic Freudian or Jungian approach that's like, let us interpret our dreams as a myth, or, you know, the monomyth. So the last thing we want to talk about today is having kind of a brief conversation about how we alter our consciousness with drugs. Because, you know, sleep is an altered state of consciousness, hypnotism is an altered state of consciousness, but drug use, and looking kind of like at the history of the different types of drugs, has been the predominant way in which we alter our consciousness. And whether we're talking about the Parisian writers, of all the expatriates like Gertrude Stein and Hemingway and Fitzgerald, taking vast quantities of absinthe to achieve a sort of hallucinogenic state, which is his own story, because I had the personal theory that they were just getting so massively wasted on this stuff that's like 160 proof, that, you know, it's not so much of the wormwood actually doing anything, it's just getting really, really drunk. Or we're talking about, you know, the use of opium and amphetamines going back until like the 1700s, or you can look even further. You know, drugs have been a very important part of our human history. And this goes, you know, we talk about medicine men in tribal culture where they're smoking the sort of peace pipe, or you can look at, you know, there's stories of the Sibyls in Grecian culture where they would drink this sort of poison, which is probably some sort of like opiate alcohol concoction, and then enter it into a static profitory state. But like the point being is that at every stage of the road, there has been an important part of our human history in looking at how we interact with drugs, how we have altered our consciousness with drugs, and kind of understanding that will put in place the current sort of discussion we have on drugs, whether it's legalization of marijuana, or the way we medicate through pharmacology, or any number of things. The conversation on drugs is incredibly varied, and far be it for anyone to claim themselves again to be kind of an expert on this. For while there might be some sort of expertise, it definitely is a huge conversation. Definitely is a huge conversation. So thinking about like the history of drugs, this goes back to the earliest part of human civilization, where like it's considered that the Egyptians building the pyramids, part of the daily regiment of payment, because it's actually assumed nowadays that through looking at the detailed records that the Egyptians had, they weren't actually using slaves. Because they found that, like, we have these ledgers that say this is how much we're giving everyone that's working, so they're just paid workers. None of this Egyptian slave stuff. But they were paying their workers in alcohol and food. But they were brewing beer. Well, it might almost be a more rudimentary version of mead. But they're brewing this sort of weird honey wine that's definitely achieving, a feel-good state. But that's the sort of thing that kind of like charters the human history, and that each civilization goes out of its way to find and produce alcohol. That's one of the most like consistent forms of drugs that humankind has. The fermenting of grains. To produce, methanol and ethanol, ethanol, not methanol, to produce ethanol and thus alcohol, has been produced from society to society. In fact, I think in terms of like looking at some of the histories of different alcoholic cases, one of the leading theories of how they stopped one of the plagues in London was understanding that it was the contaminated water source that was spreading the plague. And the reason they figured this out was because there was a little monk group that was only using their beer, and they're only sitting there drinking their beer, and because of that they're like, wait, so they're not drinking from the well, they're not drinking from the river, that must be how the plague is getting about. Leading into some of the early spreading of diseases. Being figured out because these people are sitting there drinking. Now, what are drugs? Is also a very important question. And I think for the purpose of this conversation, it's not necessarily talking about something that's legal versus illegal, because that's a hugely different concept. One that doesn't really have place in a psychological setting. That's much more of a political setting, because psychologically speaking, the way we tier drugs and the way we give drugs out, that public policy doesn't necessarily reflect reality. And this is what the whole discussion about marijuana has been, where people are saying, well, we need to align public policy with much more concerned discussion about the reality of how marijuana affects us compared to other drugs. But generally speaking, a drug is anything that affects the kind of affects our sort of mental status or consciousness. Anything that we can imbibe, take in, an external force that affects the chemistry of our brain. And just from a molecular standpoint, or an evolutionary standpoint, most of the things that are drugs are actually created, biologically speaking, as a form of chemical deterrent to being eaten. This is why tobacco is the way it is. Because if a little aphid tries to go eat a tobacco plant, it's going to die. And so I'm actually not even 100% sure that aphids eat tobacco plants. But the point being, it's these ways of plants and other creatures, whether it's a poison dart frog or something else, of saying, hey, don't eat me. And in doing so, it produces poisons. And drugs are usually us consuming those poisons and achieving an alternative effect from what the plant wanted, which was to not be eaten at all. But when it comes to drug use, it's played a very important history in not only the development of science, the development of literature and culture, these sorts of mind-altering usage has been prominent. Not only if we look at the time period of Charles Dickens and Lewis Carroll, Percy Bysshe Shelley, where all these sort of British romantic writers were heavily involved in heroin and opium and significant different types of alcohol and cocaine, like Sherlock Holmes, a famous detective. He was a cocaine addict of that time period. We also have scientists, physicists, mathematicians that were popularly, like Paul Erdos, using amphetamines. There's a very famous story about Erdos, who is probably one of the most celebrated mathematicians of the 20th century, where one of his friends said, I bet you can't go a month without using your amphetamines. And Erdos accepted the challenge. And he did survive the month. And then as soon as the month was up, he promptly went back to using amphetamines and told his colleague that what we've achieved is that we have shown that I can survive a month without amphetamines, but math itself has been set back by 1 month's time. And so he kind of had this sort of, without that sort of upper crazy drug use, he did not have the sort of mental clarity and acumen necessary to do the math at the level he wanted to do, which unfortunately no one is saying that so many of Erdos's things are constantly being explored and understood today. He was a man so far above the majority of his time. How dare we necessarily argue with that claim? But we're thinking about like the broad categories of drugs, drug usage. Essentially, just so we're kind of all on the same page, we have uppers, we have downers, and then we have hallucinogens. Uppers, for the most part, are the things that like will increase perception and increase like response time. It's the type of things that are like tobacco and antidepressants and speeds and amphetamines. It's the stuff that speeds you up, increases the heart rate, increases the blood flow. Like I said, antidepressants are one of the common forms that will start to interact with these sorts of uppers. But we also have counterpoint to uppers. We have downers. And then downers are things like morphine and opium and alcohol is probably going to be the most common downer that most of us experience in our life. But it's the type of things that will negatively impact like nerve response and conduction of electricity. Things like morphine actually inhibit the transmission of pain receptors sending information and receiving that information, to produce that sort of numbing effect. Heroin is a sort of major downer, one of the most extreme forms of downers. And I'm sure most of us have known several, well, maybe we don't, but I have known a few people that have used too much of that. And we know what happens when too much of these downers are taken and basically your heart stops. The respiratory system quits. So as uppers speed up bodily functions, downers slow down those bodily functions. And that's why like mixing pain medication and alcohol can be so dangerous, because you're taking one downer and you're enhancing it with another downer. And the real threat there is that in doing so, you shut down your system. Third type of drugs are going to be called hallucinogens. And these are the things that, while they may have a sort of bodily impact on you, also predominantly have a sort of neurological impact on you. So like people that, one of the most popular hallucinogens out there is going to be something like mushrooms, where people might take mushrooms and, there's going to be a definite bodily response. Usually it's going to be a little bit of an upper, but it's also going to predominantly produce psychological effects of, seeing things in a new way without necessarily interrupting your bodily chemistries near as much as other drugs might. And then there's, all sorts of street drugs, which are things like ecstasy and MDMA and Molly and all this other crap that, where people are trying to always combine uppers and downers and hallucinogens into oftentimes very dangerous products, because even the most, as glorious as Breaking Bad was, and that whole blue crystal whatever, it's still a very dangerous thing when people are starting to mix and match drugs inside the body, because of the pronounced effects that they have, not only on altering your consciousness, but interacting with other medication that people might be taking. So with that, I guess we'll end our little conversation on consciousness, drugs, and the altered states of consciousness. Make sure that we are preparing ourselves for the midterm, and make sure that we're getting our work done this week. Hope you guys have a great week. Take care.